All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to today's webinar on Unlocking Change, Harnessing Evaluation for Social Justice Innovations. The Center for Policing Equity is excited to welcome you all to this fireside chat today, where we're going to chat about a scaling roadmap that we developed at CPE and the lessons that we learned about evaluating and scaling programs. And so today you'll hear from two experts who will share about their experiences in conducting evaluations and scaling programs. So first off, my name is Helen Mack, and I'm a senior research associate here at the Center for Policing Equity, where I spend a majority of my time evaluating programs, products, and services that are focused on harm reduction and public safety redesign. I want to thank you all for joining us today. We will be taking questions from the audience throughout. So, feel free to put your questions into the Q&A chat box and I'll monitor that. And I'll make sure to get them to the panelists, depending on how many questions we get. So I'll try my best to get all those questions in as we're able to. Now, before we get started, I wanted to give you a little bit of context about how we developed this scaling roadmap. So in 2022, we began a partnership with the American Institutes for Research, AIR, and our program officer at the time, Kim Dumont, really elevated this issue of developing these innovations, but then sort of sustaining them and then scaling them out. And so there is this sort of gap in terms of how to do this. And Kim really wanted, or she really felt it would be beneficial for us if we could create a space where we could exchange lessons learned, like we're going to do today during this fireside chat, but also to really codify what we know and what we've learned about innovations for social justice that we could use here at CPE, but also that other nonprofits that are maybe in the social justice space that they could also use in thinking about developing these innovations and then scaling them out. So we want to give a big thank you to Kim Dumont and AIR for their funding support, which really helped us to develop this exciting new scaling roadmap resource. So I'm going to get into introducing our speakers. I'll give some brief bios about them. We are going to share some resources at the end of this webinar, and we'll email them to you as well. And so you can read more about our speakers or our panelists' bios in those resources, but I'll just give you, in the interest of time, some brief backgrounds about them too. So the first we have is Dr. Christina Peterson. And she is a survey statistician for ICF International Incorporated, which is a global consulting and technology services company that provides a range of services for governments and businesses, which includes things like strategic planning, management, marketing, and analytics. And there, Christina is currently engaged in data modernization efforts for large public use surveys. And then our second speaker is our very own here at CPE. We have Dr. Ruben Ortiz, who is the Director of Evaluation and Research. And here he oversees the design and implementation of evaluation plans to assess the implementation and impact of innovations that are focused on harm reduction and public safety redesign. And so I want to thank you, Ruben and Christina, for joining us today. I'm going to pass the mic on to you, Ruben, to kick off the chat. But first, if you could tell us a little bit more about the roadmap and then take it away from there.
Of course. Thank you so much, Helen, for that wonderful introduction. And again, thank you to CPE, ICF, and AIR for supporting this work. But most importantly, thank you to everyone who's joining us today for this important discussion. I really, really appreciate it. So why are we putting a resource together to guide the development and scaling of innovations? Well, we know that innovation is hard. In fact, in the business sector, about 90 to 95% of innovations fail. So our impetus here was really to maximize the probability for success using a data-driven model that maps the life cycle of an innovation from the design phase all the way to that scaling phase. And when we're thinking about innovation, creativity, I always kind of refer back to Brené Brown and Daring Leadership, where she says, there is no innovation and creativity without failure, period, right? So by mapping out a set of activities, focusing on data and metrics and infusing this model with strategy, we want to maximize that probability for success. So what you see here on the screen is essentially the roadmap framework, and it outlines three main milestones. Design for impact, which essentially ensures that the innovation you're designing makes sense for that space. Demonstrating impact, is it working? How well? And then disseminating that impact. If it's working, it's meeting its objectives, how do we ensure that we can scale this up sustainably? Some of the key points for this roadmap, it is evidence-based. We draw from a lot of literature from the business sector, evaluation science as well. So we really coalesce a broad range of literature into this resource. Throughout the conversation, you might hear some key terms and definitions that maybe you haven't heard before. If that's the case, no need to worry. Like Helen said, we will be sharing resources at the end of this session, and also the white paper as well as a brief. It's available online as well. So you'll have all those resources available to you. So yeah, the last thing I would say about this roadmap is the key role of evaluation and strategy as well. As evaluators, of course, we love evaluation, but another key component of this model is that strategy piece. And we infuse the whole model with strategy. And by doing so, we really seek to constrain and eliminate risks, leverage opportunities when they do arise, promote progress towards the achievement of outcomes, and of course, optimize the resources available to innovate so we can continue innovating and we can continue delivering on the mission. So yeah, we're really excited about this resource, its applicability across the nonprofit sector. But enough about that. I know y'all want to hear the conversation. So with that, Christina, thank you so much for being here. I'm going to start with you, if you don't mind. How do you go about developing an evaluation plan? How do you go about developing any sort of evaluation for programs, products, services?
Thanks, Ruben. So I'm going to look at this through the context of innovation, since that's kind of the key of what we're focusing on here, because I think that matters when we're dealing with new innovations, things that haven't been fully developed in certain areas, things that you're trying to scale, right? And so I think one of the key things to start with when you're working on infusing evaluation into the scaling process is really being clear about what you're evaluating and why. Because sometimes with new innovations or scaling innovations, it's still unclear or may not be clear to all stakeholders or those who are involved in the scaling process. What are the boundaries of what you're evaluating? Who are your participants? Who's included in the evaluation? Who's not maybe one of your key target participants or clients? What sites are included, and just being very clear on the boundaries and the scope of what you're including in this evaluation plan. I think the second key point too, when you're evaluating innovations, is to think about your evaluation theory. And I like to approach it from a developmental perspective when you're looking at innovations. And a developmental evaluation really tries to be more agile, less fixed, and more responsive to uncertainty that can happen within the scaling process, as well as emergent stakeholder questions or needs, and being able to respond rapidly to that. So those are kind of the things that I would start with. And then I think, building on that with your methods and your tools. So I don't know, Bill, based on your experience, Ruben, like when you've been developing evaluation plans for your innovations, what kind of like tools or documents do you use to kind of build out once you've established the boundaries of your evaluation?
Yeah, thank you so much, Christina. Like you said, establishing the parameters, establishing the boundary being very clear about the theory behind it, sequence of events. All these things are crucial to guide the evaluation. And, the sooner the better. The earlier we start evaluation, the easier it is to implement it, right? So in terms of tools, documents that I always find myself going towards for evaluation really are just foundational in terms of evaluation science, right? So making sure that we have an evaluation plan, making sure that we have a logic model, a theory of change, a monitoring and evaluation plan. These are things that are by no means are exciting to work on, but they really, like Christina said, lay the foundation for the evaluation and really clarifies the parameter and scope of the evaluation for all the people who are involved. So, of course, these are documents and tools that I find very essential for this effort. But another thing that I do want to highlight that you mentioned, Christina, is who's involved. When do you develop that plan? And what is that sequence of event in an ideal state? What would that look like?
I think, in my opinion, there is no ideal sequence, especially when you're looking at it from a developmental perspective, with all of the complexity that goes into scaling innovations. But I think probably the key first step is definitely understanding who needs to be at the table as you're talking through questions that come up about the scaling, questions that need to be answered in the evaluation. So the first step is definitely getting everybody at the table who needs to be involved in the scaling and the evaluation of that. But in terms of sequence, then, I mean, when you're looking at scaling a project or an innovation, there's a lot of complexity involved in that, right? A lot of it may be new. So are you expanding to new populations? Are you expanding to new sites? Are all of these happening simultaneously, or is there some sort of staged implementation? And so if you're staging your implementation, then you may have different parts of an evaluation going on at different times, depending on when they're adopting that innovation. Also, if change is not linear necessarily, change can be cyclical, change can go back and forth. You may regress and then progress. And so, how do you be agile and be able to provide real-time feedback along this process that may take a lot of unknowns as you're scaling it across different sites and different populations? So I don't know if you have a sequence that you've tried to follow, or if you've kind of seen that agility in action as you've tried to sequence it and then noticed, some changes that needed to be made along the way.
Yeah, most certainly. And that's a really good point. For me, of course, there is a preferred sequence. Like I said, the earlier, the better. But to your point, Christina, evaluation efforts are often evolving. They're like living documents, if you will. And being agile is super important. That's something that we really emphasize in the roadmap model and framework, right? We want to make sure that our evaluation efforts are not static, but they're very fluid. They move with the innovation in and of itself, right? So as we're implementing the innovation, as we're going over activities, outputs, inputs, all that, we are making sure that not only are we collecting that data, but we're checking the data, we're visualizing, and then we're making decisions based on strategic imperatives as well as what the data is telling us, right? And like you said, progress is not always linear or it goes in one direction. Sometimes there might be something that you were not anticipating, but it does change how the program is implemented or how it affects the target population. So for example, if you have a vision of implementing a program and the resources are just not there, the program's going to be a little bit different from what you initially envisioned. But you have to be able to, like you said, be agile and move with those factors, right? Evaluation doesn't happen in a vacuum, so it has to be responsive to on-the-ground conditions. And with evaluation, of course, there's a lot of uncertainty with data, evaluation, methods. uncertainty is part of the whole effort. It's part of innovating, right? So I'm curious, Christina, how do you deal with that uncertainty in the evaluation context?
Yeah, so uncertainty comes in many different forms, right? So we have uncertainty that's potentially reducible. Maybe we can collect more data, maybe we can collect data in a different way. But we also have uncertainty that's not reducible. And that can just be because systems are complex, they're chaotic, there are things that we just can't anticipate. And so, and then another type of uncertainty that we may be dealing with is social uncertainty or uncertainty that certain stakeholders may have and their tolerance for uncertainty and responding to that tolerance. So we have stakeholders who may be more or less tolerant of uncertainty based on their role or just their personality factors. Often decision makers have to, because of their role, just be more certainty oriented in order to make a decision and action that. Whereas evaluators, we tend to be more uncertainty oriented because sometimes that's just who we are, but also who we have to be in our role as evaluators. We have to be able to look for both the expected outcomes, but also keep an eye out for some of those unexpected, like Ruben said, unexpected or unanticipated outcomes that could be happening along the way as we, again, move this to different populations or different sites. There could be things that come up unexpectedly that are positive, and we want to make sure that we capture that in the future if we're doing something positive that we did not expect. But also if something harmful and or negative is coming up, we want to be able to respond to that. Often decision makers, especially in planning evaluations, are maybe less tolerant towards uncovering or looking for some of these unexpected or unanticipated outcomes along the way. And so I think these are conversations that are key, especially in the beginning of your scaling process or evaluation plan, is understanding what that tolerance is and really talking about the benefits of keeping your eyes open for some of these unanticipated, unexpected outcomes. There's a lot to say on uncertainty here, and I don't want to take up the whole space. But Ruben, how have you dealt with uncertainty in some of the work that you've done?
I'm actually going to insert a question here, a segue into this, a question from the audience. So someone asks, sometimes the utility of evaluation is hard for non-evaluators to grasp. It can feel like projects are being watched or judged. What advice do you have for project leads to help them be at ease and better partner with their evaluation team?
That's such a great question, and thank you, Helen. I'm gonna start, and then I'll pass it on to you, Christina. In terms of how do you kind of socialize the evaluation, that is actually quite common. A lot of people might feel like evaluators are coming in and, identifying any sort of mistakes or something like that. But I tend to socialize any sort of evaluation plans through a different framework, right? So what evaluation is really doing for an innovation is making sure that we can capture your successes. So if something works, we want to make sure that we know exactly why it is that innovation worked. Same thing for a program. So we're really there to capture wins, successes. And then when things don't go according to plan, that is also really, really valuable information. So from an evaluation standpoint, there's no preference in terms of the results. What we're really concerned with is capturing as much as we possibly can and build upon that, right? Christina was talking about potential unknowns and unexpected results. Those results are usually where the learnings are, and it's a key piece of information that it's really needed for innovation and evaluation more generally. If everything was perfect, then we wouldn't need to innovate. Everything would be taken care of, right? So for me, those are little gold nuggets, if you will, that I really look forward to because it informs how we move forward. How about you, Christina?
I mean, I think what comes to mind for me is as you state, kind of building this into a learning process and framing it that way, but also trying to have these conversations early about what would be meaningful for you to know, so that it's not just the evaluator or people perceiving that it's just the evaluator coming up with what's necessary to know or what the evaluator wants to know, but trying to build in, what is it that the program officers want to know, what would help them in learning, and making sure that that is brought into the questions that are being answered with the evaluation. And also tied to that, this idea of, again, the agility and the rapid feedback of how can we as evaluators make sure that we're not only answering their questions and helping them learn what they want to learn, but doing it in a way that is responsive and rapid enough that they feel like they're getting something in return, because collecting data, processing data, is time consuming, and it takes away from their ability to focus on implementing the program. And so that's a trade-off that we need to think about, is how can we make sure that they feel like they are getting something in return quickly enough to help them learn and implement the programs that they care about.
And that's so important. Thank you, Christina. I think what you're kind of speaking towards is the value creation from an evaluation standpoint, right? Making sure everyone in the project or innovation space is involved. And to your point, being very agile. That's something that we really emphasize in this resource, is that constant feedback loop, right? So the innovation, that implementation should, of course, be informing evaluation, and evaluation should be informing the implementation as well, right? So when those things do appear, we're able to adapt as needed and not necessarily wait, okay, we'll give you the report in 6 months. At that point, that information might not be super useful, but making sure, to your point, that we do create that space where information is flowing freely, so everyone is aware of how the implementation is going and how we're doing in terms of achieving the desired outcomes, if you will.
And do you have methods that you use for data collection and data communication that are, you feel, more responsive and in real time than other methods maybe?
Yeah, that's a great point. In terms of method, it really just depends on the evaluation. But for me, something that's really important is kind of having a live feed, if you will, right? So moving a little bit away from report writing and more towards like a continuous feedback loop, maybe a dashboard, if you will. In terms of data collection, for me, something that's really, really important is to make it easy to collect the data. Like you said, it takes a lot of resources to get the data. So the more you can kind of bake in data collection in the implementation of that innovation, the better. You want this to be something painless, easy, so you get the data, the team can benefit from that, and it doesn't feel like it's overburdening folks. Yeah, that's such a good question. Helen, I see you
I've got
smile.
another question from the audience, and it's nicely related to this data collection. So we have a question that says, with the need for the agility of evaluation, how do you make sure accurate longitudinal data is being captured?
That's a great question. Christina, you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, accurate data collection is a challenge at any scale, and being able to collect it over time longitudinally for participants is quite an undertaking. So I think keeping it extremely focused, especially at the beginning, and trying to do more, trying to do as, I don't want to say as little as possible, but trying to keep it as focused as possible. So rather than trying to do like a 100-question survey every 4 weeks, trying to just take a pulse, and keeping that pulse of like 3 questions or 4 questions, so that you're not overburdening the respondents and having them drop out and saying that, I don't want to take this survey over and over and over, because, this pulse of the same person over time it can be really informative. So I think trying to just keep it as simple as possible, especially when you're doing a new innovation and implementing it in a new site, is important. Ruben, do you have any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. And you bring such great points. I think that focus is key, right? And that's why I always focus the attention on the documents, being able to make sure that we put our thinking into paper. So we're really focused and direct in terms of collecting that data. And some of the things that we do have to talk about is this uncertainty in data collection. There's no such thing as the perfect data collection endeavor, right? There's always going to be measurement error. So our job is really to ensure that given the context, we try to minimize that measurement error as much as possible. And like Christina said, we do want to stay focused on what is the evaluation plan? What is the goal for this evaluation? And in terms of making it longitudinal, of course, that focus is going to be super helpful. So are we thinking of evaluating things at the city level, individual level? These are all things that are going to determine how feasible it is to get that longitudinal data and get it over time, right? So kind of being very clear, what's your unit of analysis? What is your expected outcome? Can you collect this data? These are all things that are going to inform the feasibility and then also how you're going to go about collecting that high quality data. That's so important.
Yeah, and what I'll add too, I'm going back to this idea of a tolerance for uncertainty, is that there may be a different tolerance for uncertainty at different stages of the implementation or at different stages of the scaling, right? So early on, you may have to sensitize stakeholders and yourself to more uncertainty, versus later on, once the evaluation and the scaling is more mature, maybe then your expectation for uncertainty is much higher or lower. And so I think that that's really important, because like Ruben said, there's no, all data comes with a degree of uncertainty, and matching your methods to what is tolerable for those you're working with and the stage of scaling, I think is really key. And making sure you're not expecting too much from your data collection, too much from your methods, based on where you are in that scaling process and how much uncertainty is tolerable at that stage.
I'm going to insert a question here about self-assessment now. I think this is a nice little overlap. So we have an audience question that says, do you distinguish between formative and summative approaches to evaluation when working with stakeholder groups? Do you train stakeholders in self-assessment to maximize their input?
Can you repeat that? I'm so sorry. I think I missed the last part.
Yeah, I'll read it again. Do you distinguish between formative and summative approaches to evaluation when working with stakeholder groups? Do you train stakeholders in self-assessment to maximize their input?
Yeah, so in terms of distinguishing between formative and summative, it all depends on the goal. What are we trying to do, right? So we might use formative evaluation to see how it is that we're implementing. Are we implementing according to plan? And then we might use summative or impact evaluation to say or determine whether we were able to achieve what we kind of started from, right? So we want to make sure that we fit the evaluation and type of evaluation to that outcome in our goal. So if we want to make sure that we're mapping out that implementation and we want to make sure we're doing it well, probably go with formative evaluation. If it's a later on type of question, we want to assess impact, most definitely summative evaluation. So again, the setting parameters, setting expectations, we definitely do that as much as possible. Like Christina said, sensitizing folks across the board to what is the effort going to look like, how much effort is it going to take, and what kind of insights are you able to produce from those efforts? Like I said previously, it's all about value creation and knowledge creation, right? We don't do evaluation to do evaluation. We do evaluation to push programs forward and to make sure that we're able to achieve the outcomes that we want to achieve. So in short, most certainly we make that, we're sure to socialize that difference. And then we're always trying to increase the capacity across the board to have that self-assessment as well. But how about you, Christina? What do you think?
Yeah, along the same lines, I think it just really goes back to what is the goal of the evaluation? Who's driving this goal? Is it your funders driving this goal? Is it your program managers driving this goal? Oftentimes, summative evaluation is more geared towards funders versus the learning process. And I think making that distinction between a mature program and an innovation that's being scaled is really important, especially when you're talking about your evaluation goals. Mature programs are in a better position for summative evaluation, where innovations and programs that are being scaled are maybe not ready for summative evaluation. And so being clear about that, and like I said, using this more developmental approach to evaluation, which tends to be a bit more on the formative side versus the summative, this works, this doesn't work.
That's a really good point. Thank you, Christina. And one thing that I would say along these lines is, for example, in the framework, I think that's why we've, incorporated strategy throughout, but also kind of separated the milestones into three, right? The design phase, the assessing impact, and then the disseminating that impact. Because when we're developing a new innovation, we want to make sure that it responds to user needs. And we're also interested in assessing whether we're implementing according to plan or what we had envisioned, right? And after we're able to assess whether this is being implemented as planned, of course, as that innovation matures, we can move into that space where we're thinking about impact, we're thinking about adaptations if needed, and then after that, moving on to the scale. So in terms of sequencing, like we said, depends on the goal and it depends on the maturity for that innovation as well. But it's a phenomenal question. And one thing, you all know I love quotes, so I will throw another one in here. In terms of uncovering things that you weren't expecting, Thomas Edison said once, "I have not failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work," right? So those things really inform how we make adaptations, how we move forward in the evaluation and innovation context. So, so important.
And I think what also is important here, kind of going back to some of these data quality and uncertainty issues that were brought up about collecting accurate data over time, but just accurate data in general, is talking about the stakes of making decisions given the uncertainty that's present. So I think it's really important for evaluators to understand all the types of uncertainty that they may be facing in the data, whether that's how the data was collected, who it was collected from, missing data, why is the data missing? Is it missing at random because a couple of participants were sick one day? Is it missing systematically because somebody decided not to disclose certain data points for political reasons? But understanding where the uncertainty in the data lie, and then being able to talk to decision makers about what are the stakes of making the decision that they need to make, because we've already talked about why we're doing evaluation, what decisions they need to be making. So what is the stake of making that decision given how much uncertainty and the type of uncertainty that we see in the data, based on when it was collected and all of that too. So not just being aware that there is uncertainty in the data, but how can we help decision makers understand the implications of making a decision given the uncertainty that we see.
I've got a great question here from the audience about, uncertainty and unanticipated, consequences. So I have a question here. It says, in the social justice space, there is the potential that novel interventions intended to do good could inadvertently be harmful to vulnerable communities. Can you speak to how one might incorporate an assessment of harm into an evaluation? What type of concerns should be top of mind for evaluators?
Yeah, I think for me, the first thing is implementing qualitative work into your evaluation and implementing that qualitative work early on. Oftentimes, quantitative work surveys aren't equipped for answering questions about things that are unanticipated and unknown. So for me, it's making sure that early on you have a strong qualitative component in your evaluation plans and method toolbox to be able to uncover some of those. Ruben, what do you
Yeah,
think?
that's such a good point. And you're exactly right. That is the benefit of using a mixed methods approach, right? There are things that you can capture very well with quantitative data, and there are things that you just have to do qualitative data collection to kind of understand. And in this context, in the nonprofit space, social justice space, it's very volatile. There's so many things that are varying that we cannot control. This is not a scientific experiment, right? This is implementing an innovation real time in a context that is unpredictable, uncontrollable. And I think that is why it's so, so important to kind of have this feedback loop of information. So you have the data available to you to make those data-driven adaptations as you're implementing the program. Of course, there's always a possibility that our theory of change is not correct, but that's the whole point of evaluating, right? Is giving yourself the space and information needed to be able to address those concerns if they do occur and to have a system of identifying, right? Within the nonprofit space, we want to make sure we are doing good. That's our goal. So the only way that we can ensure we do that is by evaluating, having that feedback loop, and always making sure that we are making progress towards our outcomes and goals. Such a good question. Have
I
a
have a
sense.
question for you, Ruben, about your scaling roadmap and thinking about scaling innovations. How do you know when a program is being effectively scaled or when it's ready to be scaled?
Such a good question. So in the roadmap, the second milestone is really about determining the impact, meaning can we say confidently enough that we have achieved our desired outcomes? At that point, we have a lot of criteria that indicates whether a program or innovation or product is ready for scaling, right? We draw from a lot of different literature in terms of making that assessment that tells us, okay, you're achieving the impacts you set out to achieve. You're doing this well within time. You're implementing well. So now we might think into moving into that scaling framework. And the evaluation is going to be a little bit different at that point because in the roadmap, for example, that would be the second milestone, assessing the impact. Once you move into disseminating impact, your metrics might change because you know the program works. You still want to make sure it works, but now you might be focused on things such as resourcing. Do we have the resource to move this across different contexts? Does it need to change? Is our innovation context specific, or is it generalizable enough where we can apply this with high confidence across different settings? So such a good question. It's definitely important to kind of assess whether you are ready to scale. And then as you're scaling, also assess whether the scaling plans are going well or not. And again, the data-driven adaptations are crucial for this. So if something is not going according to plan, you can remediate immediately. And if something is going according to plan, you capture that and you try to replicate it. How about you, Christina? What's your take?
So I'm just thinking and processing what you've said, but it brings to mind going back kind of to the evaluation planning and theory of change of understanding not just the mechanisms for change, but the trajectory of change and what that trajectory looks like and the time frame involved in that trajectory. So when you're looking at scaling an intervention, is there a particular, I guess, point on the trajectory that you feel you need to hit before it's ready to be scaled? Like, do you wait all the way until, the end of the trajectory where you've achieved full change, or is it somewhere in the middle or somewhere more towards the beginning where you feel like we've seen enough change in our pilot populations or our pilot program sites that this is ready to scale? Or do we need to see full change before
Mhm.
it's ready to scale? So what does, I guess going back to kind of having these clarification and goal setting conversations with your stakeholder, what does ready mean, and how are we defining ready? I guess are the questions that I would want to talk about when looking at scaling and what that readiness is.
Yeah, that's such a good point. I think kind of going back to the planning and setting expectations is making sure that we have a very good understanding of what are some short-term, medium-term, and long-term goals, especially in this sector, if you will. We have a lot of ambitious goals, which is great. Some of them might take 10 years, some of them might take 5. So what are some key performance indicators, or what are some metrics that allows us to say, hey, we thought we would see change in 2, 3 years. We've seen the change. We've actually seen much more change than we were anticipating. At that point, we could definitely start thinking about scaling if other criteria are met, of course. If we have no unanticipated consequences, if we have the resourcing, if the success criteria outlined in a pilot phase is met, we make sure that we bake in metrics as much as possible to guide our decision making. So when we say we're data driven, we really mean it. We need data for everything. Our strategy based on data. So we want to make sure that we're capturing that throughout the life cycle to make those decisions. Such a good question.
Yeah. So on the flip side of that, is there ever a time to descale a program?
Yeah, great question. Yes, I would say absolutely. If a program or innovation is not having its intended effects, and perhaps is having unintended effects or consequences, I think of course, at that point, you would probably make the assessment that it's not a good idea to scale a program that is not working, because we all have limited resources to get to our goals. So we want to make sure we maximize that as much as possible. So if in the evaluation process or the life cycle of an innovation, we get to a point where we're seeing, hey, we thought we would achieve X, Y, and Z by year 2. We're actually pretty much behind and we're seeing negative consequences. At that point, we would have to assess whether it makes sense to continue or whether it makes sense to change the program or just descale it if it's not having its intended effect. So most definitely, I would say there's always a situation that calls for scaling as well as descaling, to your point. Um, how about you, Christina? Have you seen instances where you have to descale, or what's your experience been?
So I haven't had any personal experience with descaling a program, so it's uh, definitely interested in hearing what you had to say about that for sure. But yeah, I think, and again, those qualitative pieces are so important along the lines because as you're scaling your innovation, you may have sorted out some of those unanticipated or unexpected outcomes early on in your pilot and then decided to scale. But again, keeping those qualitative pieces in throughout the life cycle of the evaluation, because as you go to different sites and as you go to different populations, different points in time, there may be other unanticipated, unexpected, both positive and negative. So I think sometimes we use unexpected as a negative thing, but it can be a positive thing. Keeping that involved, because that may be an indication that we need to push the brakes at certain sites or with certain populations and reassess where there may be gaps that we can fill, where maybe this just doesn't work at all and we can't fill gaps or adapt in any way. So yeah.
I've got two more questions from the audience. I'll give you one, and I know that we're gonna wrap up in about 8 minutes, perhaps. So if anybody else has questions, I'll start off with this one question here. It's a little bit lengthy, but this person wants to know about how do you use evaluation findings instead of, having them sit there once you've already, collected them. So the person asks, in what ways should project leads be applying evaluation findings? In what ways should executive leadership be doing so as well? And what about funders? So, kind of how do different stakeholders use the evaluation findings in different ways?
Yeah, such a good question. I think in terms of the findings and making sure they're actionable, that's a key point, right? You want to make sure that your evaluation findings are actionable, they respond to the goals of the evaluation, which again, it's why it's so important to be very clear and focused in terms of the evaluation plan. What are the questions we're asking? Why are we asking these research questions? And what is this information going to allow us to do, right? We use evaluation to create insights, and those insights, of course, have to be actionable. So it's very important that you make sure you really straddle the line between just presenting findings and providing enough information that speaks to the context and the goals of the evaluation. So, people involved across the board can make decisions using that. That's a good question.
So what comes to mind for me, going back to this idea of uncertainty, though, like we talked a lot about trying to identify sources of uncertainty and disclose sources of uncertainty and talk to decision makers about how uncertain our data is, but it can be counterproductive. And so a lot of times what we see is that when faced with a lot of uncertainty about data and information, people in general and decision makers will tend to just rely on their intuition instead and disregard the data because there's too much uncertainty in the data. So I'm going to go with what feels good in my gut, what I know based on my expertise and experience and what the goals are of my decision. So in terms of how decision makers use this information, it is key to communicate the uncertainty, but I think that we have to be really mindful about over communicating uncertainty as well, because it can lead to disuse or misuse sometimes of the evaluation findings. We also see that when people are presented with highly uncertain information, they tend to make harsher judgments about the program or the evaluand. And so that is another consequence of talking about uncertainty and disclosing too much uncertainty. So it's really finding that balance and really, I think, keeping open the lines of communication between the evaluator and the decision maker to help the decision maker use the information in a way that they are aware of the uncertainty, but not aware of maybe so much uncertainty that it leads to them disregarding the data or misusing the data unintentionally because of not being able to make sense of the ambiguity or the vagueness that they're presented with.
All right, so I have one final question here, and then we'll wrap up with this last question. This one is actually from our very own Nikki, who is one of the creators of the scaling roadmap. So the question asks, if an organization is interested in integrating evaluation into their work, what is your recommendation for how they can get started? What are a few simple steps they can take?
That's such a good question. I think the kind of first step that I would recommend to anyone is create a monitoring and evaluation plan. Really get pen to paper, if you will, or I guess no one really uses pen or paper anymore. You can use your keyboard. Make sure you open a document and you outline everything that you are doing currently, how that's informing the innovation, how that's affecting the implementation. Essentially, try to create a mind map, if you will, of everything that's associated with that innovation, and then set some targets, set some metrics. So if you're trying to measure whether hours in a meeting has an outcome, then you would probably want to measure the hours in a meeting. So being very diligent about breaking down the innovation and making sure that you have data that you can collect that speaks to those components. So monitoring and evaluation plan would be, I think, the first thing or the one thing that I would suggest to someone who might not be familiar but wants something to get started. What about you, Christina? What do you think?
Yeah, so going back to where we started our conversation off is, getting a group together and understanding what are you trying to evaluate and why are you trying to evaluate? And then I would talk about what does good mean to you? What does great mean to you? What does acceptable mean to you? And then identifying, when you can identify good means, this number of participants, this type of outcome for this type of participant, then what data do you already have on hand to answer that? And yeah, just being able to not necessarily say, this is excellent, but grade it, and be able to understand maybe acceptable, good, excellent, and what do those different grades look like for you, and then what data do you have that can help inform whether you think you're doing a good job or an excellent job.
Awesome. Awesome.
All right, so we are wrapping up now. So let me just share my screen to share a contact information. Give me just a second. All right, there we go. So thank you so much, Christina and Ruben, for your thoughts and for your conversation today. There was so many wonderful topics that we discussed. I also want to thank all of our attendees as well for coming. If you have any questions for our panelists, you can feel free to check out the resource that was put in the chat. You can find resources about our white paper on the scaling roadmap and the contact information of our panelists as well. Again, thank you all for coming. We appreciate you being here. You will receive a follow-up email with some links as well to some of the resources that we talked about today, and also a blog post that will be forthcoming. So keep an eye out on your inbox for this. And also please feel free to like, follow, and subscribe to our @Policing Equity on all social media platforms. And look out for that follow-up email from us. Thank you all again.